Joining us now from Washington is a former Venezuelan congressman, Leopoldo Martinez. In Caracas, we have Phil Gunson, an analyst for the International Crisis Group. And in Rome, Javier Farje is there. He's a journalist who specializes in Latin American affairs. Gentlemen, welcome to the Newsmakers. Leopoldo, can I start with you? Let's first talk about the electoral process itself and the result. What about the legitimacy of this result as far as you see it?
It's very difficult to call this a legitimate process. To begin, it was called by an institution that it's been already challenged under the Constitution and by the international community, the National Constitutional Assembly. And secondly, you have to think about the following factors. Major political opposition parties were proscribed. Key leaders of the opposition are either in prison or disqualified without due process of law. And most importantly, yesterday, during the election, the government coerced people to vote in this election through the intimidation that they would lose the so-called carnet de la patria. Millions of Venezuelans have only access to the benefits, the social benefits that they are entitled under the law through this government-issued card, and they had to show it in order to be eligible to receive those benefits before voting. So there was a transactional process there. Nonetheless, this whole tempered result, Maduro has received the lowest voting support ever in the last 20 years of any process in which Chavismo has assisted, either on presidential elections or elections of other sort. 15 million people hold the Carnet de la Patria, and the government claims that more than 6 million are registered. Yet Maduro was not able to show more than 5.8 million votes in support to his re-election bid.
Okay.
So that's the reason why the opposition split it over whether to participate and support Henri Falcon and others or to boycott the process. And the combined effect of all these two currents of opinion that exist in Venezuela show that there is a very significant reason to believe this is an illegitimate election.
Okay, we will pick up on many of the points you've made there, Leopoldo. But first of all, Javier Farje, as far as you're concerned, is it a legitimate result?
Yes, it is legitimate. I don't see how it cannot be legitimate. First of all, the opposition wanted the government to postpone the elections from April the 22nd to May the 20th, and the government duly obliged. If they did not think it was legitimate, why did they ask for the postponement? Why did they, part of the opposition, decided to take part? Now, the opposition is not divided because of Maduro, it's divided because of their own incoherence, their own disagreements within a wide range of political parties that come from the far right to the far left. Yes, the Chavismo has lost votes. There's no question about that. The fixed constituency of the Chavismo is usually 6 million votes, and they got this time 5.8 million, which is they have lost 200,000 because of the economic crisis. And people within the people who support the Chavismo are fed up and are tired, and therefore they didn't vote for Mr. Maduro. But they did not lose more than 200,000 votes of the usual constituency of 6 million votes that the Chavismo has had for the last 5, 6, 7 years. In relation to the opposition, if the opposition had presented a united front to fight the election, they would have had a better chance to fight for a better result. They are divided. They don't have a plan for the future of Venezuela. Some of the opposition want to bring down the government. Other people think that they should take part in the elections. Sometimes they take part. When they take part and they lose, they claim fraud. I mean, the problem for Venezuela is not so much. It's not only the problems that Maduro may have caused, which I agree that the economy is an absolute mess, but the opposition has not offered a valid alternative. The votes that Mr. Falcon, the opposition got, they did not get, are the votes that should have come from the opposition. He lost those votes because the opposition decided not to support him. And I'm trying to understand how is it that an election, which is a chance to fight back against the Maduro government, was not taken advantage of by an opposition which is divided, which is split, and doesn't have a clue on an alternative for the future of Venezuela. Every country, every democracy needs a solid, strong opposition, and Venezuela lacks that, and that is a problem for Venezuela at the moment.
Okay, we will definitely put that point to Leopoldo. But first of all, Phil Gunson, Leopoldo mentioned this Carnet de la Patria, the fatherland card. And the government had said to people, after you voted, come and scan your Carnet de la Patria in a red tent, which were these government set-up tents. There were 13,000 of them around Venezuela. Scan one and you'll get a prize, as promised by the president. Now, that's a little bit strange in a democracy, isn't it?
Yes, a lot of the votes that were cast yesterday were presumably cast because of promises like that, or more particularly because, and I think Leopoldo mentioned this, that many people were afraid that if they didn't scan their cards, then they would lose benefits, most particularly, of course, food, which is critically scarce in Venezuela at the moment. And the government makes repeated and very explicit references to the fact that the card, the Carnet de la Patria, and the code that's on it make it possible through the scanning machine for the government to know in each individual case which benefits you're receiving. And then they link that specifically to the voting process, saying when you come to vote, make sure you scan your card. It doesn't take a great deal of scientific thought, let's say, to make the connection that that the threat there, at least implicit, is that you will lose your benefits if you don't go to vote. And it's also backed up by the fact that there have been many people who've lost their jobs. I mean, we're talking about thousands of people, perhaps tens of thousands, who've lost their jobs over recent years because they were deemed to be opposition supporters. I'm talking about jobs, obviously, in the public sector. And people who've even been thrown out, for example, of public housing or threatened with being thrown out of public housing because they're regarded for one reason or another as not sufficiently loyal to the government.
Okay, so one more question about the electoral process itself. Leopoldo, Javier Farje says that people were upset or the opposition was upset and therefore didn't run in the election. And while fully understanding that many opposition leaders weren't actually able to run for various reasons, which we'll get into, is it not true that many voters in Venezuela are actually unhappy with the opposition for this boycott because they wanted their opportunity to possibly vote for someone who's not Maduro?
Well, the immense majority of Venezuelans are in opposition to the regime. However, tactically, there was a split in the core constituencies of the opposition because many believed that this election was going to be, as it ended up being, tainted or tampered by the government. What has been said by me and others here in the panel, it's absolutely true. Votes were basically bought by the government through the Carnet de la Patria or coerced people to vote.
Yeah, Leopoldo, sorry, we've gone through that. That doesn't answer the question about why there was this mass boycott by the main opposition bloc, because people have said in Venezuela, we wanted you to stand, we wanted to vote for you, but you haven't given us the chance.
Because the government did everything possible to make this election unacceptable to a very significant portion of the population. That's the game they're playing. The game they're playing is it's proposing these electoral processes in a way that are absolutely unacceptable to a significant part of Venezuela's population. It's not because of the lack of interest in the opposition to come in a united front. It's because the government creates this system that generates massive distrust in the institutions. And that's how they play this game. However, you also have to know that you do have political parties, opposition political parties, that have been proscribed. They had been banned from participating in this election month before the election. So this is a factor that it's rather unusual in a democracy as well. Not to mention that Henrique Capriles is disqualified to run for office, Leopoldo Lopez remains in prison, and many others are also in prison without due process of law. So this creates a tremendous amount of visions around the electorate on how to proceed in this confrontation with the government. But I must say that it is also important to note that this election was illegal in its origin, because under the Constitution, this election must have been held by the end of this year to re-elect or not Maduro for a sixth term in office. However, the Constitutional National Assembly was superposed to the whole institutional framework, and they precipitated this election at the time that was most convenient for the government to hold the election, and also by establishing all these conditions that made it difficult for the opposition to come in a unified front, as it should have.
Leopoldo, I like you. You keep taking the discussion forward to where I'm about to take it. Thank you very much for that. But let's just go back one step, Javier Farje. This point of Henrique Capriles, Leopoldo Lopez, Antonio Ledesma, Ramon Muchacho, David Smolansky, just to name some political leaders who have been barred from running for the offices that they would like to on the ballot paper. This is another strange issue going on with the Maduro government.
There is evidence that Leopoldo Lopez and Ledesma and other leaders of the opposition were involved in promoting violence in the streets of Venezuela. I was there when the violence was happening, and I saw it with my own eyes. Leopoldo Lopez was heavily involved in promoting violence in the streets of Venezuela. Not peaceful protest, violence. And there's plenty of graphic evidence that he was involved in this kind of violence. By the way, Leopoldo Lopez's family is, renowned for having supported every coup in the 20th century. But I agree that some of the leaders should have been let out. In the Carnet de la Patria, I'm not saying that that's not the case, that they have used the Carnet de la Patria to manipulate people. I would like to see more evidence. But if that is the case, that is wrong, and I'm not going to endorse that. Definitely not. In relation to the elections, the opposition, I said it before, the opposition asked the government to postpone the election which had been called for the 22nd of April, the opposition, the whole opposition, to postpone them. The government duly obliged. When they decided to carry on the elections on the 20th of May, the opposition decided to abandon the talks in the Dominican Republic. Why? If they were not considering these elections legitimate, why did they ask for the postponing of the elections?
Because the elections were not on the talks or the negotiation process, Javier. That the elections were provided under the Constitution to happen just a few months before January of this year, not when the government wanted them to happen.
According to the Constitution, the Bolivarian Constitution, the elections can be called by the executive power or by the Assembly.
Okay, I'll tell you what, gentlemen.
Now, hang on, listen.
Election need to be called 6 months before the date in which...
Listen, I'm going to have to interrupt both of you, okay, because we only have a few minutes. There's much more to discuss. We only have a few minutes. I want to address the democratic principles that people say Maduro does not adhere to. Phil Gunson. He creates this new chamber of lawmakers, this new assembly, because he, Maduro, loses power in the National Assembly. And then the new Constituent Assembly is full of pro-government supporters. That, again, seems like an anti-democratic act. What do you make of that?
The National Constituent Assembly that was elected in July last year does consist entirely of supporters of the government, because the opposition boycotted that election. The reason why they boycotted it, well, there were two main reasons, I think, why they boycotted it. One was that the president under the Constitution can't actually convene an election, call an election for a Constituent Assembly. That has to be done primarily by the electorate. There should have been a prior referendum, or there should have been a petition that came from the electorate in order for the president to trigger that process. But perhaps more importantly, the whole voting process for that Constituent Assembly was rigged, in the sense that there was no one man, one person, one vote. There were some electors, some voters who had 2 votes because they had what they called a territorial vote in their local municipality, and because they belonged to certain arbitrarily designated sectors like disabled people or indigenous people, they had another vote as well. The opposition regarded that as a completely spurious election, and they boycotted it. The National Constituent Assembly, according to the government, is now sovereign. It can do anything it likes. It even had Falcon, for example, been elected president in this yesterday, in the presidential election yesterday, the Constituent Assembly could have immediately voted to amend the Constitution to curtail the powers of the presidency. So this is a body which answers to Maduro. It's, as you say, a way of bypassing the National Assembly, the country's parliament, which is dominated by the opposition and which was freely and fairly elected by 14 million Venezuelans back in 2015. So that's a major reason why the international community, as well as the Venezuelan opposition, regards this whole election process as spurious. And 14 countries this morning have said that they're going to pull their ambassadors, at least recall their ambassadors from Caracas for consultations, because this is not a legitimate process.
What happens in the next 6 years, Javier Farje? Crime rates are up. Annual inflation is anywhere between 13 to 18,000% a year because it's changing so wildly. The crisis has produced the biggest migration of people in Latin America in modern times. How much is this Maduro's fault? How much is he going to be able to correct it? Briefly, please, Javier.
Yes. Yeah, sure. First of all, the Constitution says that the President and the executive powers and communities can call for a Constituent Assembly. So anyone could have done that. But anyway, first of all, yes, there's been a great deal of mismanagement of the economy. There's an economic blockade against Venezuela. Venezuela is not allowed to pay money for the medicines that have been importing from labs all over the world. Second, it is has a great deal to do with mismanagement of the economy and corruption, no question about that, but also the low prices of oil in the international markets. By the way, there's more Colombians, there were at some point more Colombians living in Venezuela than Venezuelans living to Colombia. So I'm not really sure whether the figures about the biggest immigration is correct, but I might be wrong. I'm not really going to discuss that. What is the solution? Dialogue between the opposition and the government. Maduro is going to stay there, whether you like it or not. I might not like it, I might like it. It's good to be, and he's called for a new dialogue to restart the negotiation between the opposition and the government to reach certain agreements to prevent the escalation of violence, because there could be more violence. What do you expect in Venezuela if there is no dialogue? A civil war, and that cannot be the best solution for Venezuela. So whether you like it or not, whether you like the result or not, I think there should be a dialogue, there should be an independent opposition that should sit down and talk to the government. They're perfectly entitled to abandon the talks if they believe that the government is not listening to them. Also, at the same time, the Venezuelan people have told Maduro, look, some of us support you, millions of us support you, but we are prepared to take away the votes from you if you don't change the situation.
Okay,
so Maduro
Javier,
has got
please,
a lesson as well.
Please, we have run out of time, but I want to give the last word to Leopoldo, and please, Leopoldo, be brief. Is Maduro going to survive his entire 6-year term, or is he going to be removed from within or possibly even from without?
I doubt that the circumstances as they are will permit Maduro to continue in the presidency without a significant challenge from within. He's weak. He is really weak, and his own supporters and the leaders of the coalition that upholds him in power know that. And of course, the circumstances in the economy, which are continue to deteriorate and have grave social implications, have nothing to do with international sanctions, which are normally individual sanctions targeted to the officers that had perpetrated human rights abuses. It's the mismanagement of the economy, the collapse in the oil prices, but also the collapse of private sector in Venezuela, because mostly the private sector had been either expropriated or subjected to conditions under which no one can produce. So this is just very difficult to imagine how it would sustain itself without significant oppression of the Venezuelan people. Because I want to just state something very important. There is no possibility of violence coming from the opposition. The government is in control of the military, in total control of the military, and repression starts there. And that's what happened in the streets every time there are protests. The government comes with deadly force against protesters, and in one or another event, they get a rock from the protesters or something like that. But it's because the massive oppression of the regime that will continue unless from within there is some sort of reflection about the results that happened yesterday and the initiation of a different process to find common ground in Venezuela.
Leopoldo Martinez, Phil Gunson, Javier Farje, thank you for joining us on the Newsmakers.